Cool. Well, hello, everybody. My name's Zoe, and with me I have Erin, and we are two of the mentors from the Winning Cox. And we are going to talk a bit today about understanding and getting the most from the program. And we're going to touch a little bit as well on training camp and kind of how to manage and maximize your time at training camp. So, as with all things, there are going to be different skills required with little differences that are needed to cox different types of sort of steady state technical pieces, and that is going to apply in exactly the same way to different types of training sessions. So whether that is going to be a sort of long row, which is looking to build, an endurance base, or whether that is pieces, which is looking to build your high end sort of fitness. There are going to be slightly different ways of looking at things. This session is a bit of a companion to a session that was done recently about how to cox those different types of sessions. So sort of coxing technical and steady state versus coxing racing and pieces. So I'd really recommend that you watch these two sessions kind of back to back to get the full picture, really. So there's obviously different types of pieces, and we're going to start with this, and then we're going to break it down as well into the different types of zones and the different types of sort of heart rate ranges that we should be looking at for those zones. So your steady state training sessions, if you think about those kinds of sessions that your coaches talk about, they're going to be generally lower rates, lower heart rates, more of that long continuous rowing. So if you're at a more sort of senior end, that might be kind of 16, 18, 20, 24K. But there is going to be some overlap with pieces as you do step up the rates. And pieces are going to be anywhere really between, you can do pieces at rates of 18 and 20 with higher pressure, for example, but then that's going to take you all the way up into your sort of race pace pieces, your starts, and your over pace pieces. So there's also then the separate thing is tech, which is going to be more steady. It's going to be drills. You're going to spend more time stationary. And that's obviously going to have a lower heart rate usually, and therefore is going to be a different kind of physical type of training.
Oh, we got you, Zoe.
Yes, I'm still on my previous slide. As you can tell, Erin's doing the slide and I am talking. We're not quite in sync today. So
Here.
when we talk about aerobic versus anaerobic, aerobic, which means with oxygen, so you're using oxygen to produce energy, which therefore means you can do it for a more sustained period. That's the kind of training that you're going to be doing to build your endurance base. It's going to be that longer and lower intensity training versus anaerobic, which is without oxygen. So you're going to be using energy for shorter bursts, but there is no oxygen requirement in the same way. That's building more your strength and your power, and that's going to be things like sprints, that over pace kind of training, lifting, and the high intensity interval training. And then obviously there's going to be a little bit of a spectrum between both. You're going to have some sessions where you're going in and out, or you're right on the threshold. And when we move on to the next slide, we see those different types of sessions broken down a little bit with the heart rates as well.
So, Zoe, I have a question for you, as the medic.
Oh, no, please don't ask me difficult questions.
But so how do we as a coxswainers know then if we're, coxing something that's maybe switching from aerobic to anaerobic systems, and sort of what could we do to maybe help with that and help kind of guide our athletes through that?
Yeah, so I think that's where the preparation for the training session is really, really key. So understanding in advance what kind of training you're doing and what the athletes are targeting, and then thinking about how you can be helpful to guide that. And this is probably where the other seminar is going to have some more detail. But for example, you might think, okay, when you're doing aerobic training, it is that lower intensity. You're going to have, as an athlete, a little bit more brain power, a little bit more processing power. But when you switch into that anaerobic, it's going to be kind of tougher on the body, but also tougher on the brain. You're going to have less able sort of really to think about what's going on. So as a cox, what you need to be doing there is thinking, right, how can I really simplify this? How can I, keep it as straightforward as possible, make sure that I'm really, really clear and concise. At that point, you probably want to be using fewer words, more tone, so that even if the athletes aren't taking in what you're saying from an actual word perspective, they are able to follow, the story of what you're doing because of your tonal shift, basically. But you're going to really have to simplify down there and do as much of the thinking for your athletes as possible.
Thanks.
So when we look at the training zones, people look at these in different ways. And, this is something that it is worth talking to your coach about, because different coaches, different clubs, different setups are going to have slightly different ways of looking at it. And I've kind of tried to put a few of them together in one slide just to try and make it as simple as possible. Some people go on a sort of 7 zone training plan. But again, I've tried to kind of make this relatively straightforward. So Zone 1, what some people call UT3, is going to be quite easy. It's often used as a recovery kind of training session, and you're going to be looking at kind of 55 to 65% of your max heart rate. This might be something like a recovery bike, for example, or a really, really, really low intensity rowing session. If you are doing something like tech, your heart rate might be in that kind of zone, but it might be a little bit too stop-starty to kind of call it a UT3 session, where you still want to be moving, but you want to be low intensity. Zone 2, UT2, is a kind of, aerobic base endurance training block. And actually, this is what I think in rowing most of our training is done at, essentially, is at UT2. It's going to be about 60 to 65 to 75% of your max heart rate. And this is the steady state rowing. So this is what you're doing at, 18 to 20 to 22, that kind of rate, where you are working, but you're still able to kind of, speak a sentence, that kind of thing. And this would be off the water. This might be your sort of, if you were a runner, for example, would be your sort of steady state jog, where you can still maintain a kind of light conversation with someone. But that's often the bulk of your training. Zone 3 or UT1 is more tempo work. So this is 80 to 85% of your max heart rate. And this might be longer pieces, for example, but rate capped pieces. So this might be starting to kick in around your sort of 24, 26, 28, those kinds of pieces. Maybe going for a longer distance, sort of 2, 3, 4, 5K, that kind of thing. Zone 4, which is also what they call the sort of anaerobic threshold or the lactate threshold, we're going higher again. So like now we're talking 85 to 90% max heart rate. This might be your sort of race pace pieces, for example. And actually, I think a lot of athletes in a, say, 2K race are kind of flicking in between this sort of lactate threshold and then a little bit of anaerobic as well. And then zone 5, which is the real anaerobic work is going to be, 90 to sort of 100% of your max heart rate. And that's going to be your short, very short race pace pieces, like maybe really like flat out starts, or your sort of over pace pieces. Now, I would say, to caveat, these heart rate ranges are really an example. Some people do vary quite wildly in terms of their individual physiology. So actually, if you're an athlete, you have to start developing your own understanding, really, of how your own body manages these sessions. But I just wanted to give you a rough guide so that you can have an idea of where you're sort of aiming at, where your rowers should be looking.
So the reason this is really useful for us to be understanding what training zones kind of are and what this sort of means is when we're actually thinking about, okay, you've just been delivered a training program. It may be on a weekly basis. Leander Club, where I'm training at the moment, they deliver their program on a weekly basis. When I've been at Caversham, we would get it sort of in sort of 6 to 8 week blocks. You rarely obviously are going to get a kind of a whole year's worth of training program, because your coaches are definitely not thinking that far in advance and they're reacting to what's going on. But one of the reasons we thought this would be a really useful follow-up to the previous session is actually thinking about, okay, how do you as a Cox understand what the training program is? How do you read what essentially the coach is intending? How do you then translate that and deliver sort of your best coxing, not just that week, but over kind of an individual session through to the week, through to the block, through across kind of the whole season. And you're basically really aligned with the training program and what the coach is looking for. So what we have done is basically created a bit of a model of, we've got some example of a winter training program here, and then something which you'd expect more like in the summer. And this is the sort of thing that, okay, if I receive this as a Cox, I've made this up. This is Erin Kennedy's training program. And for some of you, you might look at that and think that's not a lot of volume. Some people might be thinking, oh my goodness, but just take it with a pinch of salt. This is a really great example, essentially, of a sort of winter training program. The thing that I notice, first of all, is it stands out as a winter training program because you've got a reasonable number of S&C weights programs, which are quite long. So we're talking kind of 75 minutes. Within that, I'd expect probably 3 to 5 key lifts and some supplementary work. And you're basically getting strong at this point. There's also quite a lot of land-based training as well. So ergs and bikes, either setting a specific mileage, or you might be set a kind of a specific time as well, especially if you're training in a busy club where there's not sort of space for people to take as long as they want on an ergo. You've got to kind of share equipment. Sometimes they might be kind of limiting it to a certain amount of time. So you've got a reasonable amount of land-based training. And you can see in the total minutes down at the bottom that you're covering in that week, you've got a good sort of 5+ hours of kind of land-based training. And the winter training, if we're thinking about zooming out a little bit and just thinking about perspective, generally speaking, in that winter training, we are talking about long training sessions in terms of building fitness and building that kind of strength base, fitness base. You can see a lot of these rows I put in are relatively long, good 16K, 12K. And importantly as well, in terms of some of that kind of workload, if you look at that other little box at the bottom, we've got the total workload minute is only actually about 65 minutes. Workload minutes here is anything that is above really that UT2 general training threshold, like we said, where you're spending the majority of the time. Any of the work here, I've not put any work on the ergo, I've put it all on the water just to make it a little bit clearer. So out of those 440 minutes that I've roughly estimated it would take you on the water to get through all of this rowing content, only about 65 minutes is actually raising your heart rate above that steady training base. And you've got a lot more UT1s as well. You've then got a little bit of that anaerobic threshold, which is that 80, and then that zone 5, which is that top end speedy pieces, no minutes spent there at all. And if you think about the sort of training that you would expect your athletes to be doing throughout the winter and what they're actually preparing for, we've all just finished head race season where we have kind of worked towards that sort of top end of race pace. But obviously what we were doing at race pace, let's say we were racing on the Tideway, that's not exactly kind of like for like what we'll be doing over the next couple of months as we're getting ready for regatta season, side-by-side racing, where we're expecting higher rates, shorter pieces. So if you have a little look here, what I would be doing is having a look to see, okay, I'm brand new to this program. I've just picked this up. Well, I can see we've got pieces on Thursdays and Sundays. So they are going to be some peak days. They're going to be days where I'm going to be making sure I'm bringing my A game and we're working towards kind of something, whatever that might be, whether that's a race coming up, maybe it's a fixture we've got arranged with another boat club. And it's knowing, I think, in the winter where to spend your energy. So I remember coming back into the team just after COVID, into winter training, having not raced all summer because of the pandemic. And I remember I came in, let's say it's the Wednesday here, with so much energy for 16K and then a 16K erg. And I was sort of mismatched to the training program because I was just so excited to be there, to the point that my coach actually said, you need to calm down. It's just 16K. Because I was basically going out there and cracking the whip, in a way that actually didn't need to happen because it was winter training. We had long miles to get through, and it was actually all about building fitness. So I think in winter training, a big thing for coxes, and we're going to talk about this in a little bit, is thinking about what you could be doing during winter training, especially if they're in small boats and not in eights, about what you can be doing around the training program to basically keep sharp when maybe you're not in boats quite as much. So if we kind of remember here, we've got 885 minutes, you've got 65 minutes of workload. We're going to jump to now summer training. So we're seeing a lot less volume all of a sudden. You can see a lot more orange, so we're spending a lot more time rowing and a lot less time on land. Obviously, this is with the perfect scenario where no one is injured, which doesn't always work out, but we can see already that we're just spending one touch point on the ergo, and then we are just doing 2 shorter weight sessions. The reality is, in the summer, our coaches aren't thinking necessarily about building loads of strength. That time has sort of been and gone. Once you get to regatta season, you're not really going to have the capacity in your athletes' bodies to be doing some really big, hard weight sessions when you're potentially racing every weekend or every other weekend. So that S&C is more about maintenance, most likely. You're probably dropping the number of key lifts. And to me, when I'm seeing less S&C, it means that those S&C sessions are really important. But I know they're probably not going to be fatiguing my rowers quite as much as they will be in the winter. So, for example, here, when I have S&C on that Thursday, jumping back to winter training, 75 minutes, and then I'm going straight into pieces, I need to be cognizant that they've just done weights and they might be a little bit stiff and sore. So maybe I'm going to need to extend out that warm up. When we're coming into summer training, I can see that the S&C programs, they actually, none of the days after that, there are maybe some bursts, but they're not following on from pieces. So they can push them quite hard, but it's only 60 minutes. If you have a look, there's a lot more content. And this is, I think, some of the biggest challenges for a cox is, okay, where's my priority and what am I trying to do? The rowing sessions are generally shorter. There's a lot more 12Ks in there. And there's some things that are really specific. For example, on Saturday, in the second session, you're doing some quite specific starts. Yet on Friday, it's just 12K with bursts. Now, this may be down to you to choose what bursts might be best, and that's something I'd encourage you to talk to your crew about in the briefing, or it might be that your coach wants to get stuck in. But there's a lot more ownership and expectation on you to be hot on what you need to do within the summer training, because you're generally doing shorter sessions, but with more content. So you need to know where you need to do that on the river, what does that session look like, and importantly, what does the coach want from you? Also, in summer, when you've got lots of different things going on at once, what is the priority couple of sessions that week? It's a little bit more obvious in the winter when you're having fewer pieces, but here it's really important to communicate with your coaches and find out what the most important thing is. Is it the starts on Saturday here, or is it actually the pieces on Sunday? Or perhaps it's all the way back to Wednesday session. It's really important, basically, we work that through with coaches. And you can see the workload minute here is much, much higher than when it was in the winter. We're spending less time down at UT1, just sort of 25 minutes, but we're increasing through the anaerobic threshold and into that zone 5. So you can expect your athletes to be pretty tired. So making sure you're really hot on encouraging them to recover, to making sure that they're doing everything they need to do to basically look after their bodies as well. And then we're going to step into training camps. So when we were thinking about this session, one of the questions we've kind of been asked a little bit is sort of, how do I kind of get my head around a training camp program? Because it can look really, really different to what your normal training week might look like. We're not going to go into day by day because ultimately similar principles of what I've just been talking about actually apply to training camp. But this training camp is a really clear example of a kind of three-day cycle camp. So you've got pretty much on day 1, you've got row, row, erg. On the second day, you've got row, S&C, row. And on the third day, you've got some sort of pre-paddle and pieces. And then you go again. Training camp, it can be really easy for things to get a little bit monotonous and for you to kind of dial out. But actually, it's a really great opportunity to really be dialing in. You might have a lot of different variety of what you can do. You'll be on a different piece of water. So you may be able to do longer UT1s, for example. You might be able to do some pyramids and things like that where you'd normally be turning all the time. So thinking about, okay, what are the priority sessions on the training camp? What is the aim of the training camp technically? And essentially, where am I going to sort of need to be pushing them, and where do I need to basically be allowing them just to get through the training? It's also worth thinking about sort of travel days and things like that as well. Generally speaking, when I've been on training camp, we normally do some sort of orientation row on that first day to make sure we've rigged the boats up properly, and making sure that you're kind of hitting those right. You make sure that you supported the athletes to basically get on the day, that first day, to get on the water and get going, and then the work maybe starts the next day, making sure you're not going in too hard. And I think for me, training camp is an amazing opportunity to just spend time and be a bit of a student of the sport. So really dig into your training camp program. And I would really encourage you to sit down with your coach, and potentially, if you've got really experienced athletes who've been on these training camps before, to say, okay, what do we want to get out of it by the end? By that Thursday and the Friday, if we're doing kind of a speed order and some big race pace work, what do we want to get out of it? Have some really clear, tangible goals, both technically and physically. And you as a Cox, what do you want to develop over that training program? Because when you've got a training program like this, there's loads of variety, and it means you can really test and see sort of, maybe you want to improve your race pace work, maybe you want to be a little bit better technically on something else. So this kind of, again, leans back into that previous webinar we've been talking about approaching different sessions. And I've said it about a million times, but communicate with your coach. It's so important to think about, okay, what does the coach want from you? Because essentially the coach will have written the training program with an idea about what their desired outcome will be. So here, what is the objectives for each session? So technical and physical. So here, the example we've given is about UT2 training. How often should you be stopping? So again, what does the coach want from you? What does the coach want from the session? If they're wanting something where maybe you've got telemetry on and they want a minimum watts, they want you to be potentially really on it and really sharp and making sure that people are working hard enough in the right threshold zones, because it's basically a physical side-by-side battle paddle. Or they might actually really want some technical work, and they might not mind if you're stopping quite a lot, even if it's down as a 16K UT2. It's really important to communicate with your coach to understand essentially what the technical and physical objectives are for each session.
I think one of the biggest bust ups I ever had with a coach was about how quickly we needed to turn around doing UT2 sessions when we were training at Caversham, which is a 2K lake. So we were often doing 20 to 24K sessions, but you have to turn around every 2K. And basically, my coach was just having a massive go at me that I was taking too long to turn around. And no matter what I did, I could not get this boat around fast enough. And you guys will know that actually, even if you try and go as quickly as possible, turning around an 8, you can only do so fast. And I think in the end, I kind of had to sit them down and be like, listen, you've never coxed an 8. I actually cannot turn it around. Like, he wanted me basically the boat turned around in 10 seconds. It's like, it's going to take me at least sort of 40 seconds to turn the boat around. So you need to kind of have that, the heart rate might drop a little bit basically, but that's an important conversation to have. And I think the problem that I was having there was poor communication from both our sides. I was just getting annoyed. He was getting annoyed, and we weren't actually discussing it properly together. And when we sat down and I said, listen, can you tell me how you think I can do this faster? Because if you have ideas, I'll try them. And we sort of worked together, and then we were able to resolve this conflict. Erin, I think, probably knows exactly who I'm talking about, because probably went through exactly the same thing.
I had a very similar one with same coach, where we were doing 500s but paddling in between, and he was cross that we didn't get to the next marker. We thought we were being too soft in the 500 on 500 off, and he said, I want you there within 90 seconds in the off bit. And I did eventually point out to him that would mean that we would be going at sub 6 minute pace in our off 500s. Which
world record pace in your
in our off time. So sometimes I think that's actually really key, is what Zoe said, is sometimes the coaches have an idea in their head about what the reality of a session should be, but sometimes they kind of aren't living it. So you might interpret it in a different way, or you might think about it. One of the things that I'm often doing is potentially, when we're doing something with step rates, my athletes would generally want to finish in the tailwind. So thinking about, particularly if you are on a 2K lake, or even if you're doing something with the stream or against the stream, is making sure you know where the coaches want you to do it. But also they may not have thought about the logistics and the practical reality of doing it on a river or doing it in this section or that section because it's busy there or there's a bend. So having a little bit of a think about, okay, this is what the session and the coach wants, but how am I going to practically kind of apply it to what piece of water and what the conditions are actually presenting to you is probably quite useful. And then thinking about the feedback and the comms that the athletes might need. This is actually, we recently just shared something with Lewis Hamilton talking about he's basically just moved to Ferrari and he's basically trying to figure out with his new kind of pitwall engineer how they communicate. And this is something that we thought was really useful because actually sometimes if it's a really physical, high intensity session, as Zoe was saying earlier, less is more. And you need to basically be able to kind of communicate in the right way. If it's a really technical session, then feel free to kind of give loads of words, lots of feedback. What do they have capacity for? Where is their mental load up to? And that might also change based on the work week that they've got. If it's a really big, heavy week, they might just need a little bit more silence in those UT2 sessions where they can just kind of get in their zone, get in the rhythm and get the work done. Then there is this kind of, again, using your voice, intensity, tone, and style. We're going to drop into this in a moment, but how you use your voice and will kind of dictate to some extent what you're demanding of the athletes and what they kind of need to give back to you. And the last thing is sort of where are you in the training cycle? So we're thinking about kind of big scale all the way down to the individual session itself, making sure that back to that communication, you know where you are in the program, you know what is needed, and you know what the goals are. Because it's basically all about perspective. We're nutting down here really into training weeks and blocks. What does that season look like overall? What is your main goal? So is that Henley Women's, Henley Royal? Working backwards, you're probably just about to enter kind of the first of that regatta season block. Then you'll probably most likely have another block that will take you into regatta season. So what is the aim for this block? Is it starting to add some more speed work to what you're doing? Is it still kind of boosting a little bit that physicality? Now we've moved away from head race season. What is the aim for the block? What are the individual targets of your athletes? And what is your aim for the block too? And then once you know that, you can basically short it down to, okay, what are we trying to achieve this week? What are the main pieces we're trying to do? What are basically kind of the main objectives for the week? What are we trying to achieve? Is it small boats, big boats? And then all the way down to, once you know all of that, basically delivering a session should be easy because essentially you know exactly what the big picture is. So as we mentioned here, this basically goes hand in hand with this training versus racing webinar. We are well aware that we are delivering this in kind of end of March, coming into start of April. It is the beginning of regatta season. We have a lot of races, even in the next 6 weeks that are coming up where all of a sudden we're going to accelerate into racing. So what is demanded of you in the last couple of months versus what's coming up is going to differ. So we would really encourage you to be thinking about the technical side of listening to training program, but then there's the more practical side of essentially what are you going to do about it? And we'd really encourage you to go and watch the training versus racing webinar, and you can have a little bit of a look here about, okay, how do you deliver some of those things that we've been saying? Different voice styles, what's the purpose, giving some examples of some calls. And we're also regularly sort of updating and adding lots of different training pieces and stuff onto our socials. So you can get a little bit of an idea of how does this kind of look in 3D and in real life as well on some of our social media. And we don't want to drag this out because we think this is kind of about as good and concise as it needs to be. Basically, key communication, making sure you understand the objectives of the training program and understanding essentially what the coach wants and what the athletes need. is going to be kind of the best first few steps to understanding a training program. If you have any specific questions, we are very happy to answer them now. We would also love it if you have the capacity to buy us a coffee so we can keep doing all of this work for free and making it accessible to all. We'll be uploading this onto our YouTube. And if you have any questions about deciphering a training program, if we haven't covered anything and you want to ask us specifically, then feel free to drop us a message on our socials as well. And we've got some exciting webinars coming up next month. Starting to think a little bit more about regatta season. We're going to be doing some more recording analysis, and we are also in plans for our WOXCon 2025 as well. So keep an eye out on our socials for that too.
And our course walks.
And our coxing walks, yes. We will be at Henley Royal and Henley Women's, as well as lots of different regattas throughout the summer. So drop us a message if you want to know where we are.
So we've just had a question. The previous webinars can all be found on our YouTube page. So if you go to YouTube and type in The Winning Cox, you will find us there, and they should all be there.
Amazing. We are going to wrap it up. It's 8 o'clock. Have a lovely evening, everybody. And we look forward to seeing you on a webinar soon.
Thanks for coming, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.